Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. The Office of the Vice President, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion welcomes you to the second annual Equity, Diversity, Inclusion and Decolonization Week. We are here to celebrate and honor our diverse community by featuring a variety of events each day, beginning today, March 20th, and continuing all week long. I'm very, very excited to be starting today with this very, very important discussion with our colleague, Dr. Navid Bakali. Just before, Dr. Bakali begins his conversation, though, I just want to talk a little bit about our next event, which is this afternoon, this evening rather. So members of the Jewish Faculty Network, Windsor Law Professor Gillian Rogan and Abigail Bakan and Cheryl Nestor of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto will be given a virtual talk on anti-Semitism, reflections on how to name, frame, and challenge. So that's 6:30 p.m. To 8 p.m. this evening. And to register for the events, please visit uwindsor.ca/VPEDI. I'm going to at this moment do a really quick land acknowledgement. The University of Windsor is built on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which include the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. I acknowledge and thank the traditional custodians of the land for their wisdom and connection to this place. We invite you into a tradition with us of acknowledging and remembering whose territory you are on, wherever you are. Today's event is called Understanding Islamophobia, Coloniality, and the War on Terror. I'm going to ask the audience to leave your questions and comments in the Q&A box. And after the presentation is finished, we are going to try to get to as many questions as we can. Our speaker this afternoon is Dr. Navid Bakali. Dr. Bakali is an assistant professor of anti-racism education in the Faculty of Education at the University of Windsor. He completed his PhD at McGill University in Montreal in Cultural and International Studies in Education. Prior to joining the University of Windsor's Faculty of Education, Dr. Bakali was an assistant professor of education at the American University in Dubai. Drawing from critical race theory, cultural and media studies, and post-colonial theory, Navid's research focuses on the study of anti-Muslim racism, also referred to as Islamophobia. Additionally, his research interests include internationalizing and decolonizing higher education, refugee education, Islamic pedagogy, and educational programming for survivors of trauma. He is the author of Islamophobia, Understanding Anti-Muslim Racism Through the Lived Experiences of Muslim Youth, which was published in 2016. And he is co-editor of The Rise of Global Islamophobia in the War on Terror, Coloniality, Race, and Islam, published in 2022 by Manchester University Press. Dr. Bakali is also co-editor of a brand new journal at the University of Windsor through the Office of the VPEDI, the Journal of Critical Race, Indigeneity, and Decolonization. He has been the recipient of major international, national, and departmental grants and awards in recognition of his work. Navid is a dynamic scholar who believes in socially oriented action research that challenges prejudice and inequality by combining his research with grassroots activism. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bakali for his presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Bakali, for agreeing to do this presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Beckford. And I want to just actually give a big thank you to the office of the VP EDI, all the work you're doing in this week and all the work that you do in general. I mean, you all do an amazing job. Kayla, Katie, Miriam, Dr. Beckford, yourself, and so many other people that work with your office. You really do an amazing job to kind of create spaces where I think important critical voices have a chance, an opportunity to kind of share our thoughts and our insights. So a big thank you to you all for creating those spaces and creating an environment on the university where these ideas can flourish and be discussed in a meaningful way. And I also want to thank all the guests that have come here. I think we've had some pretty gray and rainy weather throughout the last little while, and it's a sunny day. It's not too cold outside. It's a Monday, so thank you all for joining us today. I really do appreciate you all taking time from your day to share to listen to some of our insights and our thoughts on this topic. So the presentation today is Understanding Islamophobia, Coloniality, and the War on Terror. This is really kind of taking a lot from the ideas of the book that Dr. Beckford had mentioned earlier that was published in 2022. So the presentation is a bit of a plug for this work, but hopefully there are really important insights that come out from this, and we can engage with an interesting conversation after the presentation. Okay, so in our presentation today, we're hoping to do the following. I want to discuss the book project and kind of its origins, and I think that sets the framework for kind of our conversation around this topic. And then I want to get into sort of the ideas, related to the topic of the war on terror, coloniality, and racism. So how do we understand Islamophobia in theory and practice? I want to look at some case studies as well, so looking at Islamophobia in Canada and beyond, and then have some concluding thoughts, and then we'll hopefully be able to open up for about 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. All right, so to begin with, I want to talk very briefly about my sort of the motivations or the origins of this book project that I'll be sharing with you all today. So throughout my work as a graduate student, throughout my master's and my PhD work, and even after after that period of my life, most of my work really looked at this phenomenon of Islamophobia within the North American context or the European context, typically in the global North. Most of my work and most of the literature really in the field of Islamophobia studies tends to focus a lot more on the global North. But for me, a lot of this started to shift at a specific point in after August 2017. So August 2017, for those of you that are not aware, was a moment in history where there was a massive migration of migrants coming from Myanmar called Rohingya. And there was essentially a genocide that took place in Myanmar that was targeting this group, the Rohingya. And there's a mass migration of this group from Myanmar to Bangladesh, which essentially created the largest refugee crisis in the world at the time, the fastest growing refugee crisis at the time. And over 750,000 individuals essentially overnight came to Bangladesh as refugees from Myanmar. So at the time, I was living in the UAE. I believe I was in Abu Dhabi at the time. And I had a friend that he runs an aid organization. He basically provides his organization called OBAT Canada, provides health and education services in refugee camps in Bangladesh. And so one of the refugee camps that he was doing work in, which was a relatively new refugee camp at the time in early 2018, was the refugee camp in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, which is where the Rohingya refugees fled to. And so he was passing through the UAE and he had asked me, why don't you join me and come along? And so I made the decision to visit this refugee camp. And then I was able to go again in 2019 to make a second visit. And throughout my time visiting these refugee camps, I got to hear firsthand accounts from survivors of the genocide. I was able to kind of see the lived realities of individuals there. I did a small scale research project looking at educational realities of the Rohingya children in these refugee camps. And, for me, it just became, I became very kind of curious about this issue. Like, how is it that a genocide takes place in 2017? And I don't use that term lightly, by the way. The Canadian government has acknowledged what happened in Myanmar as a genocide. Different countries around the world have acknowledged it. The Gambia has taken Myanmar to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, on charges of genocide. So this is widely regarded by many countries around the world. Though Myanmar contests this label, this designation, many countries, including Canada, have acknowledged it as a genocide. So I was very curious, how could a genocide happen like this after speaking to these individuals and hearing these stories of these individuals? A genocide doesn't just happen overnight. Some might think that it just happens like that, but really there's years and years of sort of tensions that are bubbling under the surface, and then that sort of that uh, the climax of it all is what we see as a genocide. So I began to study the history of Myanmar and trying to understand, how did this happen, and getting back to, the beginning of military rule and all these things. And the more I began to study that history and understanding sort of the precursors of this genocide, the more I began to see patterns in relation to kind of the systemic forms of racism that I've seen in other contexts, albeit at a lesser degree, but sort of the patterns that I've kind of become accustomed to seeing when looking at Islamophobia in the North American, European, and other contexts. I've started to see those sort of relationships and those patterns. And so this sort of experience really shifted my thinking on viewing Islamophobia, especially in the context of the war on terror, as a more of a global phenomenon beyond the global north, but more of a global north, global south, global sort of reality. So this brings us to the project, this book project that you saw the cover for earlier on. So this book project is an edited volume for those of you that don't know what that term means. It's a work that's compiled with a number of scholars that contributed to it. And so it's an edited volume that's covering Islamophobia from the global north and global south over 6 continents. So essentially, every continent is covered in some way in this work, with the exception of Antarctica. And so it's the first scholarly work that has done this. We were very fortunate to get contributors from around the world, from Africa, from South America, from Europe, from Australia, from North America. We really had an international sort of group of scholars that were really experts in their fields that were contributing to this work. So we had a total of, I believe it was 12 chapters. We had seven country contexts covered that looked at the global north, and 7 that looked at the global south. And we were very sort of intentional about making sure that we had sort of that equal distribution of the global north and global south covered in this work, because ultimately we want to put forth the argument that Islamophobia really is a global phenomenon. It's not just what we tend to see in the literature as being an issue that's specific to the global north. So in doing this sort of work, we kind of thought, okay, we need to kind of create these categorizations to be able to talk about Islamophobia in a coherent way when you're looking at a massive global scale. And so we created these categorizations to be able to discuss Islamophobia in a coherent way. So we created these groupings essentially. And so we looked at Islamophobia in 4 different sort of categories in settler societies from the global north. So these are nations like Canada, the U.S., and Australia, which are what I guess post-colonial scholars would call settler nations. These are spaces that were colonized by European nations, or European, I guess, superpowers, you could say, imperial powers. And they kind of created these colonies that endured beyond, that became settling colonies for them. And then you have Islamophobia that's uh, coming from former imperial powers, right? So nations that have a historical legacy of colonialism, what does Islamophobia look like in these spaces in the current context? So we looked at the United Kingdom, we looked at France, we looked at the Netherlands. And then we looked also at Islamophobia from formerly informally colonized nation states from the global south. So these are nations that were colonized by European powers that are located in the global south. So here we looked at the triple frontier region of South America, so Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, and we also looked at South Africa. And then we looked at Islamophobia in spaces where it's the most severe manifestations of Islamophobia, and these are specifically at the nation states of China, India, and Myanmar. And this was called Islamophobia at the breaking point. All right, so getting into sort of the theory or the ideas around this work, or how we kind of theorize this work. Traditionally, there's been different perspectives through which Islamophobia has been explored. And if you look at the literature, so through prejudice studies, race and critical race studies, and post-colonial and decolonial perspectives. In terms of this work, so myself and my co-editor, Farid Hafiz, who's a scholar from Austria that currently lives in the US, we decided to kind of situate our analysis at the intersections of decolonial scholarship and critical race scholarship. The reason being is because we found that the decolonial perspectives or the literature coming from decolonial thought really kind of helped us to make those connections between colonialism and imperialism and what the war on terror looks like today. And so ultimately we tried to argue, we tried to demonstrate that in many ways the war on terror is a manifestation of imperialist endeavors, right? So you have a number of sort of these colonial settler societies or contexts in which the war on terror has been taken up to kind of to advance that project. And then you also have spaces where there's a colonial history involved in how Islamophobia manifests in those spaces today. And then the work of critical race scholarship was useful because critical race theorists, they tend to look at racism from sort of existing in these different spheres, right? So racism exists in the cultural sphere, in the interpersonal spaces, as well as at a systemic level. And so that sort of breakdown or that deconstruction of racism was very useful for us in kind of understanding how Islamophobia manifests in different sort of country contexts and how there's that interrelationship between systemic forms of bias and racism and interpersonal and how it feeds into how they kind of feed into each other, as well as cultural forms and manifestations of racism. All right, so now getting into Islamophobia and sort of historical discussion around it and how the literature has kind of framed Islamophobia or explored it in different ways. Typically, the way Islamophobia has been examined in the literature is through these sort of historical moments as sort of being a precursor to what we see today. And so you have sort of the early Islamic expansion in the 7th and 8th centuries, where the early on Muslim community was able to expand beyond the Arabian Peninsula and make inroads into the Eastern Byzantium Empire and the Persian empires and beyond. Then you have the Crusades throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, where you have sort of this first interaction between Europeans coming to this sort of these foreign lands, these Muslim lands, and coming back with all sorts of narratives and stories around the exotic, these exotic lands and so on, and creating sort of these perceptions around this other group. And then a very important sort of period is the European colonial period. So ultimately, the European colonialism is taking place at a time where Europe is sort of promoting these ideas of, fraternity and, in the Enlightenment period, where, there's this idea of equality of man. And yet, despite that, they're engaging in these sort of brutal projects, which are enslaving, which are, exporting slaves and are brutally subjugating colonial subjects. And so ultimately you have a body of thinking and literature and scholarship that's coming out to ultimately justify the colonial project. And so this is not to limit it to Muslim spaces, right? Because you have European colonialism colonize people that were not Muslim, of course, as well. But there is that sort of special relationship between these European Christian, empires and their historical relationship with Muslim lands through the Crusades. And so you have this whole body of literature that's developed, which the post-colonial theorist Edward Said has termed Orientalism or Orientalist scholarship, right? And so you have this huge body of literature that's being developed at this time, which are really framing the way the Western world is thinking around Muslims and Islam. And then, of course, you have the post-World War II reconstruction of Europe. Here we have former colonial subjects that are coming into Europe. They're rebuilding European societies, and these migrant workers are beginning to settle in European nations. So this sort of cultural other now is coming, and this sort of perceived reverse colonization that's happening. And so these different perceptions around these others are being formulated at this time as well. Then you have other moments, more specific to U.S. relationships with Muslim world, so the Iranian Revolution and the oil embargo. And then, of course, you have the War on Terror. Now, if you look at all these sort of historical moments prior to the War on Terror, and even during the War on Terror, a lot of these sort of moments that scholars are kind of using to discuss and unpack Islamophobia, or the precursors of Islamophobia, are really looking at sort of this dichotomy between the Orient and the Occident, the West and the East, non-Muslim lands and Muslim lands, right? You see that sort of binary that kind of comes through in all of these historical moments. And so if you look at the literature early on after the War on Terror, after the onset of the War on Terror, most of the literature really did focus on that binary as well, because it's drawing from these historical moments. But more and more, this thinking is beginning to shift now. And so the work that we've put forward, as well as other work that is coming out now, Khaled Beydoun, who's a well-renowned legal scholar at Wayne State University, he's recently published a book. I believe it's coming out either today or tomorrow. Tomorrow, I believe it comes out. He's also written a book about this sort of idea of global Islamophobia. So more and more, the scholarship is beginning to shift and seeing this phenomenon as a more global issue than just that sort of binaristic relationship between the East and the West. Now, I wanted to jump into some case studies here to look at Islamophobia as a global phenomenon. And so what we'll do is we'll look at specific country contexts to see how Islamophobia manifests, so how there's these similarities and these differences across the global North and the global South. So I want to begin with, of course, our nation state that we're in right now, Canada. So traditionally, Muslims in Canada have been viewed as a non-welcome cultural other. This is kind of looking at the history of Canadian immigration. Like if you look at immigration law in Canada from the 1800s and the 1900s up until the 1970s and 1960s, 1970s, really the immigration law in Canada was very much based on keeping Canada as a white settler nation. Right. So if you look at the immigration laws, there was a push to try to attract white Europeans to come to Canada to settle there. And there were specific laws that were put into place to prevent Asian and African settlers from coming to Canada. So you have the Immigration Act of 1910, which was preventing African immigration on the basis of climatic unsuitability, right? So the argument that people from Africa, they can't live in Canada because they can't adjust to the climate change. You have the continuous journey provision, right, which basically prevented people from Asian countries coming to Canada unless they're able to make a continuous travel from their home country of origin to Canada, right? And so you have cases of Indian immigrants that came from all the way from Japan. So they set off from Japan. That's where their journey started, all the way to the western coast of Canada. And most of these migrants were turned away because they did not start they paused their journey. They didn't originate from Japan, and so it wasn't a continuous journey. And so on that basis, these individuals were turned away. Then you have the Chinese head tax, and you have many other sort of immigration laws which tried to preserve Canada as a white nation, right? And so ultimately, Muslims and even non Muslim groups that are coming from Asia and Africa are perceived as this cultural threat, right? This threat towards the identity of Canada as a white nation. And this begins to shift in the 1970s when Canada realizes that, well, we need to populate this nation. And it's not enough to just rely on European settlers. And so there's a dramatic shift, which allowed for a lot more immigration coming from Asian countries and African countries as well eventually. And so you have this shift that's taking place. Um, and then, so this was sort of the perception of Muslims in this earlier phase of time. But after, 9/11, in the context of the war on terror, Muslims were viewed more as a cultural threat, right? So there's this shift in the context of the war on terror where Muslims are seen more as a security threat, not so much a cultural threat now, but now a security threat. And so this comes off through this sort of securitization of the Muslim subject. You have systemic forms of racism that are instituted through the law, the Anti-Terrorism Act, security certificates, and no-fly lists that were developed. These are all legislations that came into being after the onset of the war on terror. Now, obviously, these laws are framed in very neutral terms, right? They're not framed to target any individual or any group specifically. But when you look at the individuals that have been targeted the most by these legislations, that have overwhelmingly been sort of policed by these legislations, it overwhelmingly is Muslims. And so a good example of this would be the no-fly list. The no-fly list is a measure that was put into place to prevent people that are suspicious or have suspicions around them around violence and terrorism from flying freely from taking off from Canada. And so we don't have the actual list. We don't know who's on that list. But based on reporting and people raising issues in terms of being falsely placed on this list or being falsely flagged on to be on this list, we know the overwhelming majority of people that are on this list are people with Muslim names. And so you have children that are as young as 1 year old, 2 years old, that are being prevented from boarding a plane because they have a name that resembles a name that's on this no-fly list. Now, logically speaking, how much threat can a 2 year old, a 1 year old pose, right? It's completely logical, right? But nonetheless, there's that fear, that concern around, maybe there is some kind of concern that we need to be aware of. And other examples of how we see this sort of systemic securitization of Muslims taking place is through these sort of half-baked terrorist plots that get unfolded. The most famous example of this would be the Toronto 18, where you have 18 young men from Toronto that were arrested in the early 2000s. I think it was 2005. Of those 18, 7 of the people that were charged had their charges stayed, meaning that they weren't charged. They were, their cases were dropped. And then I believe it was. Of the 11, the remaining 6 of them, they took plea bargain deals where they essentially just got off on time served. There was not really a case against them. And then you have some of them that were pled not guilty and were found guilty, and some of them were a bit more serious in nature. Now, if you look at that case as a whole, all of the evidence around these 18 young men was essentially found and developed by the CSIS agents that were involved in the case. RCMP, I believe it was RCMP agents that were involved in the case. You had agent provocateurs that were involved in this case. And so all the evidence that was used against to find these individuals guilty of a crime were procured by these agent provocateurs. The ammonium nitrate was procured by one of the informants. The weapon that was found amongst this group belonged to one of the informants. The housing facility for the ammonium nitrate, the warehouse was procured by one of the informants. These informants were paid. One was paid over 300,000. The other was paid over $1 million. Right, so huge incentive, massive incentives. So really, when you look at that case as a whole, would it really even be a case without these agent provocateurs? You fast forward to 2015, a similar case of John Natala and Amanda Kurodi, 2 individuals that became Muslim, unemployed, people that were involved in substance abuse. Again, you have this, these individuals had voices on the internet, and they, a lot of bravado and a lot of, this kind of talk that can get you in trouble. they spark the interest of another, of CSIS. And so another agent provocateur comes and is able to, entangle them into a terrorist plot. Now, what's interesting with the case of John Natal and Emmanuel Crowley is that numerous times they tried to get out of all of this. They tried to step back. And every time they tried to step back, the agent provocateur warned them that, if you back out now, your lives are in danger. So essentially, they were pretty much being threatened to engage in this plot. Eventually, in 2015, they were found guilty on terrorism-related charges. But in 2018, a judge overruled that judgment and determined that they were entrapped. And basically, the judge stated that the agent provocateur created a terrorism plot where one did not exist, right? And so you have this sort of these half-baked plots. When you look at actual numbers, if you look at the research behind, what is really a threat to the nation's security, there's over, according to Barbara Perry, who's I think probably the leading expert on far-right extremism in Canada, according to her, there's over 300 far-right and white supremacist groups in Canada. And according to CSIS as well, they've gone on record saying that the greatest threat to national security right now is far-right extremism in Canada. But what tends to kind of get conflated or charged on terrorism, according to the law, tends to be these sort of half-baked plots that really wouldn't exist if it weren't for key informants involved. And then you have other forms of Islamophobia called interpersonal forms of Islamophobia. So these are hate crimes and vandalism and murder, right? We've had a number of murders in Canada in the last 5 years. The most egregious of these are the mass shooting that happened in Quebec City in 2017. And then you have also the vehicular murder of this family in London, Ontario. Now, an interesting point to mention, of all the G7 countries, of the 7 G7 countries, in the last 5 years, more Muslims have been killed as a result of racism than any other of those G7 countries. So we have this perception of Canada being this, multicultural safe haven, but really, this can be deconstructed and looked at more critically. Let's move along now, because just in the interest of time, because I do want to have a good 15 at least minutes for Q&A. So let's look at Islamophobia in the French context, one of these former colonial powers. So traditionally, Islam and Muslims in France have been viewed as a cultural threat as well. So this dates back to the time when France was a colonial power. When they, if you read the works of Frantz Fanon, he's written about, Algeria Unveiled, where he talks about how the French colonizers in their colonial project in Africa made strident efforts to stomp out any forms of religious expression in the public sphere. And so the hijab, which is the head cover that some Muslim women wear, was prohibited in these French colonies. They tried to stomp this out. And the thinking behind this was that if you eliminate the culture and the identity of these individuals, you can colonize them and they can lose any trace of their sort of identity, their previous identity as colonial subjects. And so this sort of framing you can kind of see in more contemporary times, post sort of World War II reconstruction, when Muslims migrate en masse to France. Now they constitute over 10% of the population. And in the early 2000s, 2006, I believe it was, laws passed which prevents Muslim girls from wearing a hijab in school, in publicly funded schools. You have other legislations which again prohibit sort of the public expression of religion in French society. So the face cover that some Muslim women wear, the niqab, that's also banned in France. You have some municipalities in France which try to ban a swimsuit that Muslim women tend to wear. Now, this swimsuit is not some kind of wild, ostentatious sort of display of religiosity. It's essentially a wetsuit, but it's a wetsuit that has a headscarf attached to it. And so some municipalities, because of what it represented, because it was a religious symbol in their eyes, tried to ban this as well. And so you kind of see this, you have this perception of Islam being a cultural threat within the French society, threatening the fabric of French culture and identity. But more and more now, especially in the last few years, Islam is being perceived and promoted as a security threat. And so, especially under the leadership of Emmanuel Macron. In 2022, when Emmanuel Macron began to kind of develop his re-election campaign, he realized that it wasn't enough for him to be a centrist politician. He didn't have enough support in the center on the left to re-elect him. And so he began to dabble more and more in far-right politics because of the popularity of Marine Le Pen. And so he, in 2022, he gives this important speech where he discusses the criminalization of political and Islamist separatism. Now, these are terms which are not at all defined, but essentially, when you hear, his the way he's framing these terms and these ideas, essentially any form of religious expression can be, labeled as political Islam. Contesting the government's sort of policies which limit the freedoms of Muslims can be deemed or considered political Islam or Islamist separatism. Um, any form of sort of expression that can voice discontent with the government can be viewed as Islamist separatism. And so essentially through this rhetoric around criminalizing political Islam and Islamist separatism, it essentially stripped away Muslim political agency in France. You have a number of religious institutions being shut down. A number of mosques are closed in France under this legislation. You have a number of charitable organizations that are shut down under this premise as well. Social organizations and so on. The list goes on and on and on. Again, when you have these undefined terms and you just label anything you don't like as political Islam or Islamist separatism, there's a stripping away of rights and political agency. So you have this combination in France of this historic legacy of viewing Muslims as a cultural threat, and then you have this added on sort of view of Muslims being this sort of security threat. You combine those together, they're more and more being viewed as an existential threat in French society. Moving along now to the global south. So we'll try to wrap it up here as quick as we can. So here we have the example of the Uyghurs in in the People's Republic of China. So the Uyghurs, they're a specific ethnic group, Muslim ethnic group in China. They differ from the Han majority, and you do have Muslims that are from the Han majority as well. It's not just limited to the Uyghurs. So traditionally, this group of the Uyghurs have been perceived in Chinese society, in the People's Republic of China, as a cultural threat or a separatist threat, a threat to the cohesiveness of the People's Republic of China, right? And logically speaking, they're culturally different, they're ethnically different, they're linguistically different, they're religiously different. They are different people because ultimately they're Turkic people, and so the land that they're from is a part of a colonial settler colonial project. And so this group of individuals, or this sort of community, has traditionally been viewed as a cultural threat because they threaten the cohesiveness or the unity of the People's Republic of China, or the identity of that republic. But in more recently, they're being viewed again as a security threat. There, you have these massive internment camps where you have over 1 million Uyghurs which are kind of have been forced to go to these camps. Now, these camps are labeled as re-education camps. They're camps to prevent radicalization and so on. But again, when it comes to these ideas of radicalization and terrorism and so on, these are constructs that are defined by people in positions of power. So growing a beard can be construed as being radicalized. Fasting in the month of Ramadan can be viewed as being radicalized. Observing your daily prayers. All of these things are, it's in the hands of those that are in positions of power that make these determinations. And so you have over 1 million of these of this community that's essentially being put into internment camps and are being exposed to forced re-education. This is tantamount to cultural genocide, right? But the justification and the sanitization of this is through these people being a security threat. So in the context of the war on terror, ultimately, everything and anything can be justified. When it comes to national security, when it comes to securing your borders, when it comes to the threat of the specter of terrorism, everything and anything can ultimately become justified, right? Even if it's cultural genocide. And we can see even in the case of Myanmar, actual genocide becomes sanitized as well. So if you look at the case of Muslims in Myanmar, the Rohingya, traditionally they have been viewed as a cultural threat as well, right? They are different from the Burmese Buddhist majority in Myanmar. And so, since the 1960s, they've been viewed as this sort of cultural threat. But again, more and more in the context of the war on terror, you have, the people, people that the governments that are in positions of power, which are, using the context of the war on terror and the discourses around Muslims in the war on terror to justify these egregious actions. And so, in 2021, the Gambia took Myanmar to the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide. And the then Prime Minister Aung San Suu Kyi, who since that time has been under house arrest, Myanmar has fallen back into military rule. She voluntarily went to the International Court of Justice to testify that and to essentially double down on the idea that what happened in Myanmar was the rooting out of extremist elements within the Rohingya community. And so, despite the all the evidence to the contrary, despite the the satellite images of scorched towns, despite the numerous cases of mass rapes of women and girls, despite the fact that 250,000 people left Myanmar, left their homes, essentially over 70% of that community left that country and became a diaspora or became refugees. So despite all the evidence to the contrary, again, in the context of the war on terror, actions like this, though they can be questioned critically, ultimately it creates a space where that narrative can circulate, where you can essentially, sanitize in some way, and you can make a defense to protect your actions, arguing that this was in the name of security, and this is the name of national security. Again, the war on terror has created a context where anything and everything can be justified. So a few last points here. Um, Ultimately, what we try to argue in this work is that the what's developed in the war on terror is a very slippery kind of logic that's developed, and I've termed it war on terror logic. It's a very paradoxical way of thinking. So war on terror logic, this very paradoxical viewpoint, imagines terrorism and other forms of political violence as existing exclusively through Muslim otherness, while simultaneously sanitizing blatant manifestations of them emanating from within the nationalist space and subject as a requirement to police the dangerous Muslim. In other words, in the war on terror, essentially what's happened is that it's created discourse and an understanding around terrorism more as a construct than anything else, that it exists within this Muslim subject. It exists through Muslim otherness. And the only way to police this form of terror, you need to securitize the Muslim subject. And in doing so, in some spaces like in the global south, like in Myanmar, you have forms of state-sanctioned terrorism to be able to police it, and that becomes justified, right? So this is sort of completely upside down way of thinking, where in order to police terrorism, you have to engage in acts of terrorism to do that. And so it's really created this sort of this wild way of thinking where everything and anything can become justified. So to summarize really quickly, when we look at Islamophobia in Canada and beyond around the world, in the context of the war on terror, it's really created this securitization discourse, which very much ties, depending on the country context, to a historical legacy of colonialism, or in more present times in different country contexts, to ways of advancing settler colonial projects. So there's that very sort of intimate connection to colonialism and imperialism in the war on terror. One last slide here. I didn't want to end on such a sad note, talking about genocide and all this negative stuff that I've been talking about for the last 30 plus minutes. So I want to end on a little bit of a positive note, and that is, in the work that we've done here, hearing from scholars from around the world, we were able to kind of see how there are lots of signs of Muslims resisting, this form of oppression. So Muslims are confronting and resisting Islamophobia in spaces across the global north and the global south, in the spaces where they're able to do so. They aren't just passive victims that have accepted the terms of the war on terror. They're seeking to define themselves in different ways through different means. It could be political activism. I have a good friend that's an MP here in Canada, Samir Zaberi. We go back from probably over maybe 20 years or so. He's a member of parliament, and he's advocating for his community. He put forth a bill in the Canadian Parliament to bring in Uyghur refugees, and that bill passed. And so through his work and his effort, Canada's accepting more Uyghur refugees. You have grassroots movements. You have organizations that are trying to reconstruct the narrative or redefine the narrative. You have individuals engaging in arts-based forms of resistance, through poetry, through song, through music, through other art forms, where they're resisting this narrative of Muslims of Islam and violence and terrorism being imposed upon them. Through comedy as well, you have a number of Muslim comedians that are redefining the discourse and questioning, critically examining the discourse around Muslims in the war on terror. So ultimately, Muslims, in many spaces around the world, are resisting, and they are providing counter narratives to what's being imposed on them in the war on terror. So Muslims are not just oppressed victims in all of this, but they are individuals seeking agency as well. So I wanted to end there to give a good 15 minutes for Q&A. So thank you so much for attending, for being here, and for listening to my thoughts and my ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Bakali. That was compelling and thought-provoking, and certainly lots of food for thought there about a really pressing issue. I think we have evidence that suggests that Islamophobia is actually on the rise. And therefore, this discussion, I think, is quite timely. And thank you so much, too, for ending on a positive note. I think that's really, really important. That we don't just see this through the lens of victimhood, but also through resilience and thriving and flourishing. I think that's really, really important. Some really good examples there that we perhaps don't pay enough attention to in Canada. The issues with the Uyghurs, for example, the Myanmar situation. We've seen so many of those kinds of things, and I don't believe we have paid enough attention or made the connection between some of those things and the global Islamophobia phenomenon that you talked about so eloquently here. I'm going to open it up to questions right now. So if you have your question, please go to the Q&A icon at the top of your screen and pose your question.
We've got
Zoreen
one question in the comments. Yes, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Zoreen has a question for Dr. Bakali, and she asked, how do you define cultural threat imposed by Islam as perceived by the West?
That's a good question. I keep on throwing around that term. So for me, what a cultural threat is it's looking at kind of a national mythology around, identity, national identity. In the wake of the nation state, you have sort of these sort of projects within nation states that try to really define an identity, a homogeneous sort of outlook, and so on. And so typically, nations will create these myths around sort of these national identities. And so what Muslims have tended to do is because when they occupy minority status, they can kind of contravene, or they can go against that sort of national mythology or sort of that national narrative in some ways. In spaces like France, that's very obvious, very, very kind of clear. In the Canadian context, I think that, we do kind of frame ourselves as a multicultural nation, but ultimately you do have sort of that perception that I think has been there for a very long time, where it's by people that have been here for generations, they construe it as a sort of a white, so European colonial settler project, right? So cultural threat is kind of, I think, going against that idea of a mythology that's been created over time around the nation, and to try to kind of create a cohesive narrative of what we are, and to create and promote sort of national identity.
Thank you so much for that. There's another question from Zorine as well, and she's asking, what are your thoughts on the role played by the media in this negative narrative, promulgated around Islam, and so many.
That's
Go ahead.
excellent question. I think so for me, I look at media as something that has a lot of potential. I think most Muslims would just see the media as sort of the enemy, right? And I think that that's a bit problematic as well. I think that Muslims need to see the media as something that they can kind of have an influence on as well. Obviously, the media has sort of, has represented groups historically, marginalized groups historically in negative ways, for sure. You can't deny that. But I think that there's a lot of potential for Muslims creating their own forms of media in the current context that we live in. Pretty much everyone and anyone can create content now, right? So I think that there's a lot of potential for Muslims to create narratives through media. Now, how popular as that media becomes, that's, again, there's a lot of challenges that might exist there. But I think that we need to move beyond sort of this view of media as just being the enemy. I think in many ways it has been detrimental to a lot of communities. But I think that there needs to be more of a sort of constructive view towards it as well, and to critique it when it gets things wrong, or when it vilifies a community, but also use media platforms and create media of yourselves where you can redefine narratives, and that's the part of the resistance that I was referring to, right? I mean, I think Muslims, the thing that was inspiring to me in all of this was looking how Muslims have taken up various forms of resistance through things like the media as well. So I think there's a lot of potential for Muslims and other groups as well, other marginalized communities, to use the media as a tool to fight for, or to create advocacy for themselves.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And you're right. There are a lot of marginalized communities who actually think that the media works against them without, seeing it as an opportunity, perhaps, for them to, contribute to the narrative, if not change it. I have another question here from Margaret, and she's asking, how does Islam interact with indigenous or land-based religions?
I mean, that's a good question. I think
Mm.
that so theologically, I don't know if I'm not a religious scholar, so I don't know much in terms of that. But in terms of, I think, fighting for, or I guess finding alliances, I think there's a lot of opportunity for communities like this to work together. One thing that I think, being a Muslim living here, it's unfortunate that a lot of Muslims remain very insular, and they don't try to make connections with other marginalized communities. So I think that there's a lot of potential there for that. So I do think it's something that's important, that there needs to be progress in that sort of that space, and I do see a lot of potential for that, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. Good answer too. I'm just wondering, Navid, because you talk about that insularity, and it's I guess a missed opportunity to develop solidarity, with other marginalized people, and in the work that we're doing here at the university, one of the things we're concerned about is sometimes, that tendency for oppressed peoples to be in competition with each other, instead of perhaps focusing on that solidarity, that would benefit us all. And I just wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think I think there needs to be an acknowledgement as well within communities that are here that, like, there is a sort of a history of oppression that exists within this space here, and so there you can't fight for rights for your community without acknowledging the historic communities that have been marginalized as well. It's a part of a similar narrative, right? So I do think it's important for us to kind of understand that people that are doing work in this area, this space, you do need to kind of understand that, a part of your rights being protected are a part of, it goes hand in hand with other people's rights as well, and so communities that have been historically marginalized, I think that it's important for us to kind of learn from them. I think that these historic communities have a lot more experience as well, that these sort of relatively newer communities can learn from and take from. So building alliances and working together, I think that, ultimately I think there's a lot of commonalities and a lot of common goals between various communities. Most people just want to live in dignity. It sounds simple enough, right? And so I think that's a collective effort, however you want to look at it. So for sure, I think that, it's important to kind of think of how we can live in dignity on a wide scale. And if everyone's, has that, then I think everyone's kind of safer, right? So yeah, I think that's important to work towards.
Yeah, so we have 3 minutes. If I think we probably have time for one more question. I think this is actually the perfect way to close out this segment. But the question from Zareen is, moving forward, how do we actually address Islamophobia? How do we try to eliminate Islamophobia? And she's asking, do you have any strategies? I think this is really important because, tomorrow is actually the day observed across the globe by the United Nations as day for the elimination of all forms of racism and racial discrimination. I just wondered. I know that's a heavy question, about how do we really get our arms around this around Islamophobia. You have a minute.
All right, it's tall order. So I mean, I think different things that come to mind. Number one, I think, is education. So at different levels. So look at your spaces that you work within, and how can we engage in educational initiatives there. Whether you're someone that's in different spaces, education doesn't need to be overly formal. It can be very informal as well. So working towards educational initiatives. Creating, again, networks, working with different groups, and also I think just like taking the time to, honestly, for me, the smallest things have an impact. Like I think just, I think when it comes to Muslims, we need to kind of demonstrate how, we can be good people, good neighbors, good colleagues, and so on. When it comes to non-Muslim people, it's just, learn what's around you. See, Muslims are a significant portion of Canadian society now. We're, across Canada, we're about 7%. Within Windsor, Ontario, we're 12%. It's a significant community. So take the time to learn and speak to colleagues, and try to work towards breaking down barriers as much as you can. So yeah, I don't. It's a long question. I don't think I can fully answer it, but ultimately,
absolutely.
Education and interaction. That's what I can say.
That was great. Absolutely. No, I agree with you 100%. Navid, thank you so much for coming. We're out of time. I see. Thank you for the audience who came today and for participating. This was, really inspiring and a really, really good start to EDI week. I just wanted to remind everybody that we have another session this evening starting at 6:30. And we have members of the Jewish Faculty Network, led by Windsor Law Professor Gillian Rogan, and colleagues from OESI who will be doing a virtual talk on anti-Semitism. And this session is being hosted, being moderated by our own Kate Johnson, Executive Director of Office of Human Rights, Equity and Accessibility. We thank you again, Navid, for this wonderful talk. Congratulations on the book and on the work that you're doing. And thanks, everybody, for coming this afternoon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks. Bye, everybody. See you this evening. Bye.